it's a really interesting addition to the macOS malware families that we've seen floating around for the past, really since the beginning of this year when malicious copy and paste got so popular and kind of pushed Atomic Stealer and some of these other stealers into the top 10 for the first time. This one uses dead drop resolution and blockchain EtherHiding techniques. And also, it's kind of interesting. It's partially based on MacSync Stealer. There's actually an interview with one of the devs because apparently all of the Mac OS malware devs love to do interviews and talk about like the drama and what's happening behind the scenes and how stuff gets developed. But yeah, it's interesting. Phexia is very, very interesting.
Welcome back. I think at this point for the last few months, it feels like I've been here as often as you have. So we're both a little new to SecOps Weekly.
We're back again.
We are back again. We're going to go over our intelligence insights yet again. So for those of you who are familiar, welcome back. Stef, thank you as always for being here.
Love it.
It's going, and I know we have a bunch to cover today.
Oh my gosh. So much. We had something about this past month. We just had a lot of really interesting things happen. It was like 2 months of insights crammed into 1 month, which is not bad, but it means we have a lot of interesting things to talk about today.
Lots of action. All right, we're going to get into it.
All right.
I'm going to let you rip ahead. I feel like I've got a lot of learning to do this month as well. So I'm going to hang on and answer questions or ask questions. And if anyone live has questions for Stef, please just go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on them. We'll try to take them as we go.
Yes, absolutely.
Take it away. What do we got?
Well, first of all, we have ClearFake. It's still at #1 for the 3rd month in a row, I think, 3rd or 4th month in a row. And that's because malicious copy and paste is still really effective. I've been coming on every month and talking about how effective it is for, I feel like, the last however long, but it's true. It's still really effective. And so for our first 3, we haven't had a huge amount of shakeup this month. Screen Connect has been in our top 10 for a little while. Scarlet Goldfinch has been, just like last month, hanging around in 3rd. But then for the rest of the top 10, we had a huge shakeup, which was interesting because for the rest of this year, it's been pretty consistent. We've had a lot of kind of frequent flyers in the top 10. This month, we had 4 completely new threats debut in the top 10. And then we had a bunch that were out of the top 10 but had been there before, come back into the top 10, and a bunch that had been in the top 10 drop out. So we just have a whole lot to talk about with all this new rearranging that's happened. And we're going to get into particularly the debuting threats a little bit more, so I won't harp on those too much because we're going to talk about them some more in a second. But we had GraphSpy, Phexia, CastleRAT, and EtherRAT all debut in the top 10 this month. So lots of exciting things to talk about. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about this a little bit more too, but there it is. We had some threats come back into the top 10. So let's go ahead and talk about those since that's kind of the context for everything that's happening. So again, ClearFake, still at #1. Just Ask Jackie and Amber Albatross and Gamma are all back in the top 10. This is really interesting. Just Ask Jackie and Amber Albatross haven't been in the top 10 since March 2026. It is very coincidental that that was the last time they were both in the top 10, and this is the time that they're in the top 10 again. These are not in any way, shape, or form related. I feel very confident in saying that. And if you'll remember, we haven't talked about it a little bit. Just Ask Jackie is that family of AI and PDF tools that masquerade as a useful utility. People download them, and it gives them a whole lot more than just a useful utility. So I think last month, Just Ask Jackie was mostly PDF readers and editors, which is a very popular way of disguising these kinds of malicious threats or threats with malicious intent for kind of casual observers to try and get people to download them. It's kind of interesting. And then Gamru, good old Gamru. Gamru, I think, has been in the top 10 more than maybe any other threat across the entire history of the intelligence insights, it had fallen back for a little bit, but it's still around. Gemaru is always just kind of lurking a little bit.
It's like a cockroach. That's great.
It is. It is. It's like when we get
Well,
Configure popping into the top
yeah,
10 every now
I,
and then. It's like
I was just gonna call it out. That is like that's like the one thing that still will survive nuclear fallout. Gamma and Vicker.
it is. It is. All right. And then we have a bunch of threats that have been in the top 10 that then fell out of the top 10. Some of this is context that I feel pretty good about like doing some speculating. So I'm gonna say things like Castle Loader, ACR Stealer, and Vidar. There's been a lot of rotation in and out of the list for things that are being delivered with clear fake or malicious copy and paste. So for a while, it was Hijack Loader was a really popular loader that was then going on to deliver payloads. And the Castle Loader, ACR Stealer, Vidar are part of that shakeup. So we just are seeing a lot of adversaries continue to try out new kinds of loaders to deliver additional payloads and new kinds of payloads, particularly info stealers, to sort of accomplish the goals that they'd like to. And those are just sort of, again, trends. Those are cycling, those are changing. The ones I want to call out as being particularly interesting are Net Support Manager fell out of the top 10 for the first time since September of 2024, which I went back and took a look at that because I was really curious about if we could figure out why that might be. I think there's a couple of reasons. And again, this is like Stef's hot takes, but they're like well-founded hot takes. So like maybe like lukewarm or slightly toasty takes. I think that part of the reason for this is that some other threats became more popular malicious copy and paste payloads recently. So Net Support Manager had been a very popular payload on its own for a while, and that's fallen back a little bit also, and I could not make the correlation as concretely as I would have hoped, but we are seeing increased use of Screen Connect and other RMMs. And I think that that may be one of the reasons why net support use is starting to decline a little bit. I think that adversaries are just using other kinds of RMMs to do their shenanigans. So we'll see. We'll see if Net Support Manager stays out of the top 10. And we'd like to emphasize again, this is malicious use of these things. This is not counting valid use in customer environments. This is all malicious use. And then Atomic Stealer also fell out of the top 10 for the first time since last August, which is an interesting coincidence. So maybe, I don't know, sometimes operators go on vacay, but we've also seen increased use of other stealers and other Mac related stealers. So um, I won't give too many more hot takes about that, but it's interesting, especially when we have this much of a shakeup to see what moves around and think about what the context for that might be.
And I do wonder, as we're going through, for those who are familiar with our threat detection report, like we're going to do our mid-year update as always. And it does feel like, those things, particularly all of the Steelers, RMM tools, things like that, they're falling in and out of the top 10, but I'd say they're almost like, I just kind of feel like they're this baseline activity that's always there. And like, there's
Yeah.
always too much of them. So even if
Mhm.
they're not in the top 10, it like definitely means that there's like, doesn't mean that they're not a problem anymore. So I think that's been like, that's definitely felt like the through line where it is like, what they do next after that initial gaining that initial foothold is that's always in a little bit of flux, but like also like the orbit is small.
It is, and
Yeah.
that's a good point. Like when we say they're out of the top 10, it's not like we didn't see any malicious net support use. We did still see Atomic Stealer and malicious net support use. Just not at the same volume as some of these other threats last month. So
Yeah.
I appreciate the call out.
Yeah. These things are often on the margins for better or for worse, right? So,
Mhm.
all right. Yes, let's get into the four newbies.
Okay, so again, we're gonna have our intelligence insights come out on Thursday. We'll have more about these in much greater detail. And I'm gonna give brief overviews because I want to talk about some of the things they have in common more than I want to talk about them separately. So just very quickly, GraphSpy has its own slide, but this is the latest device code phishing threat that has made it into the top 10 this year. We'll talk about that more in just a second. Phexia is actually not new to our tracking. We've actually been tracking it since November, but this is the first time that we've seen it in enough volume for it to make it into the top 10. So this is a good example of something that we've been seeing for the last several months, just at a lower volume level than we saw last month. So just enough to kick it into the top 10, but we've been observing it for quite some time. And it's a really interesting what addition to the macOS malware families that we've seen floating around for the past, really since the beginning of this year when malicious copy and paste got so popular and kind of pushed Atomic Stealer and some of these other stealers into the top 10 for the first time. This one uses dead drop resolution and blockchain ether hiding techniques. And also, it's kind of interesting. It's partially based on Mac Sync Stealer. There's actually an interview with one of the devs because apparently all of the Mac OS malware devs love to do interviews and talk about like the drama and what's happening behind the scenes and how stuff gets developed. But yeah, it's interesting. Phexi is very, very interesting. If y'all were here last week, you heard Tony talk about it a little bit too. And then CastleRAT and EtherRAT are our two most recent remote access Trojans or remote access tools. And CastleRAT, we've seen delivered with ClearFake and Castle Loader, so they are related. So if you remember, Castle Loader debuted last month. CastleRAT has also been delivered similarly, which is why that's kind of got the similar naming schema. And that one is in particular a rat with two different versions. So it's got a Python version and a C version as well. Um, and it also uses, again, I don't want to spoiler it, also uses dead drop resolution. And one of the more interesting things about this, and we talked about this with Castle Loader as well, this is another one of those threats that uses bring your own runtime or bring your own installer tools. Or not tools, but like leverages those options, which makes detection really interesting because when you first start seeing it, you're seeing things like Python installers, which can be a little unusual enough that some might overlook it as being regular developer tooling, or like you're like, this is Python, what is this? Again, we talked about that a little bit last month. But yeah, it's there. I was talking to our subject matter expert on the team about it. I'm like, what would you want me to say about CastleRAT? And he's like, it's a pain. So that's the official hot take for that. And then EtherRAT, again, very briefly, it is another Node.js strat that is hitting Windows systems, and that's also a malicious copy and paste and run installation. And there's also a Linux version for that one, which is intriguing. And it also has some overlaps in techniques with some of the other threats that debuted this month, which we'll talk about more in just a minute. But I don't want to get too bogged down in them individually because, like I said, we have like these techniques I really want to talk about because I think that that's the really interesting takeaway from this past month.
Yeah, I was gonna say like there's certainly seems to be a ton of overlap in terms of like the lore or the initial access kind of vector, and then obviously it's the a whole bunch of clever like platforms and protocols used for C2. So yeah, this is yeah, let's keep pushing because I know we've got a little bit to cover in each of those, and yeah, definitely want to take some time to spend on like the blockchain and Telegram.
Mhm. So
Okay.
let's talk about GraphSpy really quickly because device code phishing has been in the top 10 now three times this year so far. And GraphSpy is not related to GraphRunner. They again obviously focus on the same kinds of techniques, like they're trying to access the same kinds of information, which is why they have the same name, but GraphSpy and GraphRunner are just not related, unlike CastleRAT and Castle Loader. That's not at all confusing. So it's an open source tool. You could actually just go look at it on GitHub. Love that. And it does a lot of the same things that some of the other device code phishing threats that we've seen have allowed people to do, allowed adversaries to do. And because it offers this GUI, this really easy to use interface, it allows less sophisticated threat actors or adversaries to do these kinds of activities. So I think that that's one of the reasons why this particular tool has become a little bit more popular, is because it is very easy to use. It's kind of lowered the bar for access in the same way that a lot of the as a service shenanigans made it easier for adversaries to do things like start doing their own, malicious copy and paste campaigns or use stealers, et cetera, et cetera. So that, again, we'll have a little bit more about GraphSpy in the written insight when that comes out on Thursday. And also, I believe that Mitch, our cloud and identity subject matter expert, is going to come on and jam about some of these things too, hopefully sometime in the near future. I'm not sure exactly when. And he'll probably have a lot more to say about it because this has been something he's really done a lot of wonderful work with investigating this year, which is fantastic. Mitch is on next week. That's what I thought.
There
Okay,
we
so
go.
come back
Nice.
next week if you're interested in identity and cloud threats, and if you're interested in more kind of information about these kinds of device code phishing threats. Mitch will be here. He's fantastic. He can answer all your questions.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. All right, well, yeah, without further ado, let's dig in. Let's talk about some of this dead drop resolvers and just a general kind of C2 shenanigans, because I think this is definitely obviously common to 3 of the 4 newbies. So
It is.
yeah.
And it's really, when I was looking at this, I'm like, this is really striking to me as I'm writing up the summaries for these. How many of these different threats are currently using dead drop resolvers? Again, this is not new. How many times, like, if we had a nickel for every time you and I come on here and we're like, this isn't new, but it's getting used again, we would have like a whole bunch of nickels at this point. There have been a ton of threats, also previous threats in the top 10 that have used dead drop resolvers. Grand Arrow is an example. Let's see, PlugX. I think PlugX is one of them. I was looking at the list on the dead drop resolver MITRE attack technique page that Chris just posted. So yeah, we have a whole bunch that have been, it is PlugX, that have also used like Pastebin was really common. So the threats in the top 10 this month that are using dead drop resolvers are Phexia, CastleRAT, and EtherRAT. And the reason why this is so useful is there's a couple of different reasons. Is because it allows adversaries to more easily fly under the radar, right? That was the reason why it was such a pain initially when certain adversaries started using things like Telegram, because there were permissions for access to these sites, these public-facing sites. Like, what are you going to do? Restrict access to Google Docs because you're worried that Grand Arrow is going to come in and like use that as access to fill in, C2 information for the next stage of their attack. Like it's just really difficult to defend against these. Not impossible, but really challenging, which is why adversaries like them. And it's intriguing to me to see so many of them kind of pop back up all in one month, especially with these threats that are debuting this month.
Kind of thinking, I'd say the use of like Telegram, obviously blockchain is like unique in a bunch of ways, but even just thinking like back to rewinding a little bit, and this is still used today, but just people like using GitHub gists, like they're just like there are quite literally limitless ways to do this. And even I think as long as malware has been around, just like putting text into a DNS record and like those types of things. So it's just like that is the whack-a-mole aspect of this is super, super challenging.
It is.
They're just like effectively limitless different platforms you can use to just put these things out there. Pastebin. I mean, it's like the list is long and distinguished, unfortunately. So
Unfortunately, absolutely. And so, like I said, we've got these 3 threats that we have seen using it recently. And again, there have been many more. But I just wanted to call that out again as something that is an interesting theme for this past month.
yeah, and we have a question here. So there's a question from Ani just about whether unmanaged IoT devices play a role in spread of these adversaries once they gain access to a network. And I think that might be like probably not specific to these threats you're looking at on the screen. I don't know that we've seen a lot of that, Steph. Like, is that
And there
in
are reasons
general,
for
like,
that. Like because of our own visibility into things, Internet of Things and those kinds of devices, we don't sometimes have great visibility into Internet of Things devices and the management of them. So that's one thing to take into account is that, we started out as an endpoint company. So we have a lot more insight into those things. So I want to caveat that and make that point first, that this is not an area that we tend to have a lot of insight into. That said, I would say that as far as environments with a lot of unmanaged IoT devices, I think we see a lot more worms and things like that more often because you've got different kinds of devices connected to the network, and there are more likely to be kind of different operating systems that can spread those kinds of more easily self-propagating threats across an environment. So I think that if I was going to pick on one malware family for unmanaged IoT devices, it'd be more likely to be worms than these particular kinds of rats or, these kinds of threats.
yeah, and I'd say like this is not specific to, unmanaged IoT, which I guess these things are all a little bit weird in terms of distinctions, but I'd say like devices that aren't properly patched or secured. Um, you
Yeah.
know, I guess even, like where we operate aside, we know from obviously like Zscaler research, but also quite literally, I think probably literally any company's research, particularly folks that are doing incident response.
Hmm.
So I'd say like great reporting from like the, Mandiant, Google, whatever they're called now, team.
Hmm.
Um, in
Dragos,
general, we
Dragos.
know like less so for like post exploitation spread, but like as an initial access vector, we obviously see that industry wide a ton, meaning like compromised routers, compromised edge devices, things like
Yeah,
that. So
this is true.
a little bit less of like a lateral movement kind of lever, but
Hmm.
much more of like an initial access vector for like those types of devices in general. So
Hmm. Hmm. Very
awesome. All
good.
right, cool. So let's talk a little bit more about ether hiding. So let's dig
Okay.
into this just a bit more, like lower level, next level of detail. So
Okay. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about ether hiding in our mid-year report, which is exciting because this is something that has become a lot more common. And that's one of the themes this month, which is intriguing. We've talked about it before. So when I came on to first talk about ClearFake, we talked about it a little bit then, in that ClearFake would very often use blockchain sites in their JavaScript codes because those JavaScript libraries were not as easy to, like, you can't remove them. Like, they're inherent, they're built into the sites, they were available to use. And so ClearFake would do things like reach out to these blockchain infrastructure sites and pull down, additional, like it says here, operational data like C2 addresses, again, for adversaries to reach out to again. So this is something that is not only being used by ClearFake, we're also seeing it used by Phexia as well as EtherRAT, which is why EtherRAT is called EtherRAT. And so the reason, again, why it's so effective is because these blockchain infrastructure sites or this blockchain accessibility that is built in to a lot of websites, because it's there, because it's already in the scripting, it's in the site, and you can reach out to these like smart contracts, reach out to these blockchain nodes. It's difficult to defend, and it allows adversaries to really easily and quickly and dynamically update the C2 information across all of the installations. So, especially for threats like Phexia, which allows a lot of control by the operators, they're able to, and I think EtherRAT as well, can reach into sort of this modular setup, change some of this information, and update C2 information across all or many of the installations, which makes it really tricky to defend against as well.
And those will be changed sometimes, right? Is that correct? So, and for instance, like they don't have to have obviously like that can be chunked out across, presumably an arbitrary number of records, right? Which I think
Hmm.
might make that even more difficult.
Hmm.
Um, so they might not need to change, all aspects of it, which is like, yeah, I just kind of imagine these things all over the place with pointers to one another. That just seems like yet another, it's like a full-on labyrinth that we've got to figure out. So
Hmm. The smart contract callouts are particularly interesting because there's been a lot of really interesting research done lately looking at these smart contracts and overlaps between different kinds of threats. So I expect that this is something that's going to continue to be leveraged, probably by an increasing number of threats, just because it is so effective. It's tricky to do, but as adversaries get better at lowering the bar to access for other adversaries, I expect that we'll be seeing more of this technique in use.
yeah, absolutely. Well, if the if the incursion into our top 10 this month is any indicator, this is not the this is not going to be a fluke.
Mm-mm.
All right, we got a few minutes left. Want to talk through tips for remediation. Some of these, I think, for those of you who are frequent visitors here, you'll have heard before. But yeah, let's start with GraphSpy because I know that device code phishing in general we've talked about before, but and that one obviously is also like somewhat unique amongst the three. So.
Mhm. So again, some of this is, like you said, due diligence that's similar to prior recommendations for these kinds of identity threats. So things like revoking affected tokens and active sessions, resetting the account, resetting credentials, requiring reauthentication, all of those good things. And also, those conditional access policies that we've discussed before are also very useful in helping to remediate and prevent GraphSpy from having a lot of effect in your environment. So we've mentioned that in previous insights. We will link to more information about that in the upcoming insight, but that's still the case for GraphSpy as well.
Yeah, and like I'd maybe wrap those all up as like identity protection kind of 101 at this point, right? I think
Hmm.
things
Hmm.
are, if they're not common, we want them to be common.
Yes.
And they're definitely not specific to GraphSpy. I feel like those controls will take huge classes of attack like out
Mm-hmm.
of, which is super important. All right, so Phexia, which is obviously this is the most Mac OS specific of them, I believe. So
Yes. And Phexia, you'll see a lot of these kind of launch agent um, commands being executed, which is one of the things to look out for if you're trying to determine if something is Phexia. Remove the content that's referenced by the plist file that you'll see, because that's going to be how it is both persisting on the system and also executing its scripts. So if you can remove the content and remove that from disk, remove the file from disk, then it will no longer have persistence and it won't be reaching out to its C2. So that is kind of the quickest and easiest way to remediate Phexia activity on an endpoint. And then CastleRAT, it's delivered via threats that we've talked about before. So it's delivered via malicious copy and paste. With ClearFake, it's been delivered via Castle Loader. We talked about that last month as well. So if you're able to detect malicious copy and paste, particularly those finger up caret commands that we talked a little bit about in last month's insight, those will prevent installation of any additional payloads. So I guess that's both a good thing and a bad thing about malicious copy and paste continuing to be so effective. Is we are talking a lot about it, the community is talking about it, there's a lot of good indicators for it. And if you're catching malicious copy and paste, you'll also catch anything that might come after it, including Castle Loader and CastleRAT. And also suspicious C2 communications in general, because we tend not to see it get that far. We haven't called out that as specifically across all of these threats, but that's another good way of figuring out if something is doing evil shenanigans. If there are external callouts from an unexpected service, that's always a really big red flag, but y'all know that. I don't have to tell you all that. And then EtherRAT. Um, EtherRAT's interesting. Consider whether Quick Assist is how common is that in your org? What's the actual kind of approved use cases for Quick Assist and kind of scrutinize it accordingly. If it's not needed in your environment or if it's not needed by everybody, you might want to add some restrictions or kind of uh, just sort of baseline that. And for EtherRAT in particular, if you see those call outs to things like those blockchain domains or those other low prevalence domains, that's a really good way of determining whether or not activity might be malicious. Um,
And quick call out there if I can too. Well, first I'd say I know like another thing maybe we haven't mentioned explicitly, but um, is useful across these and many of the other like threats that we will discuss is like for quick assist is like yet another kind of plug I'd say for app control and just defining like where in your org that's allowed and even if you can stomach it
mhm,
denying things that aren't explicitly allowed from that perspective. And yeah, the low prevalence column, I know that's like, that's a go-to for, I'd say for incident response in general. Like it's a really handy way to get a handle on what's happening inside an org and find things that are unusual. But our threat hunting team very commonly will go, just starting to look for, you mentioned just like services initiating outbound comms, like looking for combinations there that aren't well known or that are low
mhm,
prevalence and domains in general. Yeah, like those are just
mhm,
such huge techniques for just spotting things like this that you can't quite explain.
mhm. And then for TLS inspection, because we were talking a little bit about that ahead of time, according to our malware experts, it can get you an idea of sort of the URL endpoints involved, and the malware can have patterns in what it is reaching out to if you do some TLS inspection. And you also might be able to see specific HTTP headers as well. For example, EtherRAT has a specific header that it exposes in its requests, which is x-bot-server. So yes, TLS inspection can also be useful for kind of an additional piece of information in determining what activity it is that you're looking at on a system.
Yeah, if you do like having that definitely opens up a ton of detection engineering opportunities because yeah, like so much of these, like particularly in C2 land, I'd say like so much of this depends on an assumption that people aren't looking at anything that's encrypted. So like if you do have that as a kind of tool in your arsenal, that is, yeah, can be absolutely huge for some of these types of emerging techniques. So
For sure.
awesome. All right. We kept you over, Steph. We kept everyone else over,
We
but I'm
had so
glad we
much to
did.
cover. Like, I feel like we did a good job. 2 minutes isn't bad.
Yeah, no, it's and I think everyone has hung on. So appreciate all you sticking around, Steph.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And if anybody, you'll notice we've got the YouTube link here for the Astute Observer. You'll notice that this branded as Threat Labs by Zscaler this week. So we'll be transitioning. And for what it's worth, I say transitioning is like the things that you know and love. So monthly intelligence insights, our threat detection report, and all of the Red Canary, security operations, threat research and intelligence. Is merging and I'd say like getting, even a little bit more holistic and hopefully has a lot more reach now as we join forces with the folks at Threat Lab. So look for more of that to come. And thank you all for being here. Steph, thanks as always. Like this was absolutely, this is a treasure trove of new information that I think it's going to take me until next month to go read up and learn on. But,
Well, the insight will be out Thursday, so more info there. Always a pleasure. Great to see y'all.
sweet. Cheers. Thank you. Have a great day.